The phone felt heavier than it should have, though I'd held it 1,000 times before. I stood at the window of my modest rented apartment, watching the gray December sky darken over the city I no longer recognized as home. My voice was steady when I spoke. I'd practiced steadiness for 2 years now, but inside, my chest had begun to collapse. "Holden, darling, I just wanted to confirm my flight lands at 4 p.m. on the 23rd. I'm so excited for Christmas," I said, listening to the silence stretch like taffy. My small, worn suitcase sat by the door, already packed with the careful wardrobe of a woman who no longer existed. The sigh on the other end was theatrical, practiced, the sigh of a man who had become expert at performing disappointment in his mother. "Mom, I wasn't expecting you. You must be confused again," he said, his voice carrying that sharp edge of irritation that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. "Audrey and I made these plans weeks ago. We're taking a private jet to St. Bart's tomorrow morning, the 23rd. We're leaving at dawn. Actually, the guest room." He paused, letting the pause do the work. "We gave it to Audrey's mother this morning. She's helping us with some important arrangements for the house sale. You'll need to cancel your travel immediately." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The crushing weight that descended on my chest felt like it might split me open. "Did you hear me, Mom?" His tone had shifted to concern now, the performative concern of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment. "Are you still there? See, this is what we were worried about. You're forgetting conversations we just had." "I heard you," I said quietly. "I heard you." After we hung up, I stood motionless for what might have been minutes or hours. The profound cruelty of his dismissal, delivered not as an apology, but as a statement of fact, as though my presence required explanation, as though my love required justification, settled into my bones like a chill that would never fully leave. "My name is Julia Vance. I am 55 years old. I used to command boardrooms. I used to understand the architecture of power, the geometry of strategy, the precise angle at which a well-placed question could dismantle an entire corporate theory. I used to be someone. Now I was this, a woman dismissed by her son, gaslit into believing her own mind had betrayed her, living in a rented apartment that smelled faintly of other people's mistakes. I slowly set the phone down on the cheap veneer of my nightstand, and that's when the tears came, scalding and bitter, and somehow more humiliating than the phone call itself. For 2 years, since my husband Michael had died, I'd been watching Holden and Audrey execute what I can only describe as a carefully choreographed campaign of systematic isolation. It had started subtly enough. A comment here about my memory, a concerned look there when I mentioned a business decision I'd made. "Are you sure you remember it that way, Mom?" Audrey would ask with her bright, practiced sympathy. Michael might have mentioned something different before he passed. Michael, my rock, my partner of 30 years, the man who had believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The gaslighting had intensified as my grief deepened. Every memory I shared was misremembered. Every financial document I tried to examine was a sign that the stress was too much for me. They insisted I couldn't manage the stress of the Red Oak Cottage, the beautiful Victorian home I'd inherited from my grandmother, where Michael and I had raised both Holden and my daughter Clara. It was too large, they said, too isolated. I was too fragile. I needed to be near them, they explained with such patience, such terrible kindness. Within 18 months, I'd sold the cottage and its surrounding land to a development company at their recommendation, of course. I told myself they were right. I told myself I was crumbling. I told myself their concern was love. The money from the sale had been enormous, nearly $4 million. But somehow, after taxes and legal fees and urgent matters, most of it had been consolidated into accounts I no longer fully understood. Holden had taken power of attorney just in case. Audrey had insisted on managing my calendar to reduce your stress. Slowly, carefully, methodically, they had built a cage of concern around me, and I had walked into it willingly, believing their lies because I was grieving, and grief makes fools of even the strongest among us. The money I'd wired them last month for urgent tax debt, I now realized it had likely been the price of those plane tickets to St. Bart's. The tickets to a Christmas vacation they'd planned without me, had somehow expected me not to know about, had now turned into evidence of my own cognitive decline. I was 55 years old, and I had been successfully erased from my own life. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I thought clearly. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I made myself tea, hot, strong, the way I used to drink it when I was making 7-figure decisions in conference rooms. I held the cup with both hands and watched my reflection in the dark screen of the microwave. I didn't see a fragile, confused woman. I saw Julia Vance, corporate strategist. Julia Vance, who had built an empire from scratch in the technology sector. Julia Vance, who had raised a son who was apparently not worth the oxygen required to breathe the same air as him. Holden's words, "You must be confused again," had been meant to diminish me. Instead, they'd cracked something open inside me. Not anger, exactly. Anger is too hot, too inefficient. This was something colder, more precise. This was clarity. They had wanted me weak. They had needed me weak for their own success to matter. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the source of my strength. They had thought it lived in my bank accounts, or my properties, or my ability to command a room. They didn't understand that my real power had always been something far more dangerous, my mind. I pulled on a warm coat and took the public transit pass, something Holden had insisted I never use because it was too complicated for me, too risky for a woman losing her faculties. The rebellion I felt walking to the bus stop was exquisite. The bus was crowded with people living ordinary lives, and I stood among them feeling anything but ordinary. I was 55 years old, and I had just begun to remember who I was. When the bus dropped me off at the corner of Oakmont and Fifth, I walked slowly toward the street I had known my entire adult life. The neighborhood had changed, new construction, young professionals replacing old families, but the red oak cottage still stood at the end of the lane, a ghost of itself. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. The cottage wasn't being renovated. It was destroyed. The entire structure had been gutted, stripped down to rotting beams and exposed foundation. Copper piping had been torn from the walls. The beautiful bay windows, the ones where I'd sat reading with Michael on Sunday mornings, had been removed and replaced with cheap, flapping plastic sheeting. The oak banister that Michael had hand-carved over 3 winters, the one that had been a symbol of his patience and his love, was gone. This wasn't renovation. This was theft. I understood it then with perfect clarity. They had sold the cottage's equity to a development company, taken the proceeds, and then systematically stripped the physical structure for salvage value. Copper wire, lead pipes, hardwood floors, fixtures, everything that could be removed and sold had been removed. What remained was an empty shell, worthless to anyone, the perfect abandoned property for avoiding taxation while claiming to maintain it as part of my estate management. The irony was vicious. They had told me I was too fragile to visit, too fragile to manage the property, too fragile to understand its value. And while I believed their lies, they had disassembled the only physical anchor I had to my own history. I sank onto the curb in front of the chain-link fence they'd installed to protect the property they'd claimed, and I finally understood the depth of their wickedness. But I didn't cry. The sadness was too vast, too absolute to be expressed through tears. Instead, something else moved through me, a granite-hard resolve. I took out my phone and began photographing everything, close-ups of the gutting, Wide shots of the desolation, the empty rooms where I had held my children, where Michael had proposed to me, where I had lived the most important moments of my life. These weren't photographs for evidence in some family dispute. These were documentation of an act of profound structural betrayal. They had assumed I was incapable of strategic thinking. They had believed their own narrative of my decline. They had made the critical mistake of underestimating the quiet woman in the rented apartment. As I turned to leave, I made a silent promise to the ghost of the house. They would pay for this. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but strategically, legally, and irreversibly. Back in my apartment, I accessed something I had kept hidden for a decade, my encrypted files, the holding company documents, the IP registrations, the patent filings, the legal architecture I had built in the shadows while everyone believed I was fading. Holden was currently in the final stages of negotiating a $2.8 million contract with Technova, a major software development firm. The deal was his magnum opus, the proof of his genius. The contract was contingent on the implementation of what he called his revolutionary data modeling system, the Apex protocol. Holden had publicly claimed, in interviews, in his resume, in his patent filing, that he had invented the Apex protocol during his graduate studies. It was his alone, his creation, his proof that he was brilliant. The truth was different. I had invented the Apex protocol, not partially, not as a foundation for his work, entirely. The entire framework, the algorithm, the core innovation that made it revolutionary. All of it had come from my mind during the years when I was running a private technology incubator. I had been exploring data modeling systems, imagining the future of how companies might organize and understand their information architectures. And I had cracked it. The solution had come to me in a dream, actually a moment of clarity where all the pieces of the puzzle aligned themselves. I had spent 3 months coding it, testing it, refining it until it was not just functional, but elegant. It was one of the best things I'd ever created in my entire career. When Holden was struggling in graduate school, uncertain about his thesis project, I had shown it to him, not to be credited, simply because I was his mother and I loved him. Use this, I'd told him. Build on it. Make it your own. I had thought the gift would inspire him. I had thought it would help him find his footing. I had thought it would be an act of love that he would recognize and remember. Instead, he had taken it, claimed it, built an entire career on it, and eventually forgotten that it had come from me at all. But I hadn't forgotten. While he was receiving the accolades and building his reputation, I had quietly done something he had no idea about. I had secured the legal rights to the core technology. I had created a separate legal entity, an anonymous, impenetrable holding company called Apex IP Holdings, LLC. On paper, Holden was listed as the creator, but in the actual legal structure, he was a 2% non-voting partner. I, through a series of complex shell corporations, was the 98% silent, controlling majority owner. For 10 years, I had allowed him to use the technology. For 10 years, I had collected my silent royalties while he built his career on my genius. For 10 years, I had been the invisible architect of his success, and he had never suspected a thing. His entire professional life was a house of cards, and I held the only card that mattered. I called Marcus Thorne, my lawyer, the only person who knew the complete architecture of my financial life. Marcus had been Michael's best friend before he became my most trusted counsel. After Michael died, I had given Marcus explicit instructions: protect the IP structure. Tell no one. Especially not Holden or Audrey. Marcus had done exactly as I'd asked. In the chaos of my supposed mental decline, He had quietly managed my assets, maintained my legal structures, and never once revealed the truth. "Marcus," I said when he answered on the first ring, "I'm activating the Apex Protocol IP audit. I want every single license agreement Holden has signed using that IP. I want to see every contract, every representation he's made about its origin. I'm particularly interested in any clause related to moral turpitude or origin of invention." The intake of his breath was the only sound on the line for a long moment. "Julia," he finally said, "do you understand what you're asking me to do?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm asking you to go to war." While Marcus worked on the IP audit, I spent 3 days reviewing Holden's personal financial records that were still accessible to me through accounts I'd never relinquished, even as I'd allowed him to believe he controlled my entire financial life. What I found was beautiful in its vulnerability. Holden and Audrey had purchased a luxury penthouse in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. The purchase price was $2.4 million. They had financed it with a massive bridge loan, a high-risk financial instrument that required them to pay only interest for a limited period, with the full principal due on a specific date. The fine print of the loan agreement was where the real danger lived. If Holden's Technova contract failed to close before December 31st, the lender could call the entire loan due immediately. In other words, Holden's entire financial life was balanced on the razor's edge of a single transaction. He was not just ambitious. He was recklessly overleveraged, betting everything on his own brilliance, convinced of his own untouchable genius. If the deal fell through, he would lose the penthouse. The bank would foreclose within weeks. He and Audrey would be financially devastated. It was almost too perfect, but I wasn't going to move yet. Not until I had all the information I needed. I spent those 3 days also reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. A former colleague who now worked at Technova gave me the contract timeline. The deal was set to close on the afternoon of December 24th, Christmas Eve. Holden was scheduled to give his final presentation to the client at 2:30 p.m. sharp. If the presentation went well, signatures would follow, and the money would transfer before the day ended. Holden and Audrey had planned to leave for St. Bart's on the morning of December 23rd, secure in the knowledge that by the time they returned after New Year's, the contract would be closed and his VP position would be guaranteed. The timing was elegant. It was almost musical in its precision. They would leave me alone on Christmas, believing I was too confused to matter, and return to a life transformed by their success. On the evening of December 22nd, Audrey texted me. I was expecting something cruel. Instead, it was far worse. It was concern. "Mom, Holden told me you seemed distressed on the phone yesterday. The message read, 'We want you to be okay. Please make sure you're taking your evening pills. We're worried about you, and we want you to stay safe and calm while we're away. We'll check on you when we get back.'" It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, a perfect documentation of my instability for their own records. They weren't checking on my health. They were building a paper trail proving I was mentally unstable, just in case I ever became inconvenient enough to challenge them legally. I typed a response. "Thank you for the reminder. I am perfectly calm." I sent it, and then I turned off my phone. Marcus called me on December 23rd while I was packing a bag for a hotel. "I have the documents," he said. "Julia, this is airtight. The Technova license agreement contains a moral turpitude clause, a standard provision in IP licensing. It states that if the inventor is proven to have committed fraud regarding the IP's origin, the majority owner can terminate the license without penalty." Holden signed off on the creator declaration in the patent filing. He falsely claimed 100% originality and failed to disclose the true origin of the technology. "That's fraud," I said. "That's 10-year-old fraud," Marcus corrected, "but it's still actionable. And Julia, I have the dated documentation proving you created the core system. I have your development notes. I have the original code you wrote before you showed it to him. This isn't circumstantial. This is forensic. How long to prepare the IP audit letter? I asked. 6 hours, Marcus said. But Julia, once we send this, there's no taking it back. Holden will know it was you. Technova will launch an investigation. His career will be over. I need you to be absolutely certain this is what you want. I thought about the red oak cottage, gutted to its bones. I thought about Michael's hand-carved banister, gone forever. I thought about every Christmas memory, every family photograph, every moment of beauty that had been systematically stripped and sold for scrap metal money. Prepare the letter, I said. That afternoon, I checked into the Meridian Hotel under the name Eleanor Bradford. I had booked the presidential suite. A small indulgence, but I had earned it. The windows overlooked the city skyline, and from my vantage point on the 40th floor, everything looked beautiful and far away and manageable. I ordered room service. I took a long bath. I sat in the quiet lounge watching other people live their ordinary lives, and I felt perfectly at peace. At exactly 2:15 p.m. on December 24th, I received the text from Marcus, documents ready, sending at 2:30 p.m. to Technova CEO's office, as instructed. Certified delivery to Holden's legal department will follow. I set a timer on my phone and waited. At 2:30 p.m., I sent Marcus the go-ahead. Then I sat in silence. Holden would have been mid-presentation when the chaos erupted. I imagined it with perfect clarity. Him in the conference room at Technova speaking about the revolutionary Apex protocol, showing projections, demonstrating the brilliance of his vision. The CEO's face, composed and interested. The clients leaning forward. The moment when Holden was exactly where he wanted to be, exactly as confident as he'd ever been. And then the assistant enters. The CEO's phone buzzes. The room's energy shifts subtly, like pressure changing before a storm. The CEO excuses himself, returns, his expression unreadable. I think we need to pause the presentation, he says. There's been a legal development. The revocation of licensing authority would have been served to his desk in that moment. A formal legal notice from Apex IP Holdings, LLC, stating that the Apex Protocol IP license had been terminated effective immediately due to fraudulent representation of the technology's origin. Attached, 10 years of documentation proving that Holden had falsely claimed sole creation of a technology he had been given by his mother. Attached, the patent filing showing his false declaration of originality. Attached, Marcus's certification letter stating that the majority owner of the IP, someone Holden had no idea existed, was revoking his license. Technova's legal team would have been contacted simultaneously. A cease and desist letter, preventing the continued use of the Apex protocol in any form. A notice of potential fraud, alerting them to the risk of contractual liability if they proceeded with their deal based on IP they no longer had rights to use. The $2.8 million contract would be dead before the signatures dried. The investigation would have already begun, not just into the deal, but into Holden's entire career history at Technova. Every project he'd worked on, every success he'd claimed, every innovation he'd attributed to himself, all of it would now be under scrutiny. The question would ripple through the company. What else had he lied about? I knew from my contacts at the firm that Holden was immediately suspended without pay. The public humiliation was swift and brutal. By evening, industry contacts were calling each other with the news. By the next morning, it had made the tech blog circuits. Rising Technova VP suspended over IP fraud. His former colleagues, already resentful of his arrogance, spread the details with vicious enthusiasm. IP fraud, stolen technology, a decade-long deception. The narrative crystallized almost immediately. Holden Vance was not a genius. He was a fraud. Simultaneously, the bank that held his bridge loan received notice of the contract failure. Within hours, a demand letter was issued requiring immediate repayment of the full principal. The foreclosure clock on his luxury penthouse began ticking. Everything I had planned, everything I had calculated, was unfolding exactly as I had scripted it. At 3:15 p.m. on December 24th, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, a blocked caller ID. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, M.O.M. Holden's voice was high and cracking, barely recognizable. What the hell is going on? My deal just imploded. The CEO is screaming about some company called Apex IP Holdings. They're saying the IP is stolen. What do you know about that company? Please, Mom, tell me what you know. They're saying the protocol is stolen. Is this some kind of mistake? I kept my voice perfectly calm, perfectly flat, perfectly professional. The voice I had once used in boardrooms to deliver verdicts that would reshape companies. Holden, as I told you, I'm not particularly familiar with the technical details of your business ventures. I said, didn't you tell me you invented that system yourself? Perhaps you should consult your contracts. I'm afraid I'm not the person to help you with this matter. Mom, please. His voice was desperate now, unraveling. There's a legal letter here from something called Apex IP Holdings. It says I committed fraud. It says the IP was stolen. Mom, I don't understand. Can you help me? I paused, letting the silence stretch between us, letting him understand what it felt like to be dismissed, to be gaslit, to be told your confusion was your own problem. Holden, I said, finally, your memory needs to be sharp right now. You're a smart man. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Don't worry your head about things you don't understand. And then I hung up. I turned off my phone and ordered a bottle of their best champagne. On Christmas Day, the silence was deafening. Holden didn't call again, but Audrey did. At 11 a.m., her voice shrill and uncontrolled, stripped entirely of its usual cultivated sweetness. You did this. You did this, you old jealous witch, she screamed. You're going to ruin us. Why would you do this? We helped you. We saved you. I let her scream for a moment, and then I spoke with a gentleness that was far more cutting than any anger could have been. Audrey, I said softly, you didn't save me from the cottage. You destroyed it and sold the copper wiring for scrap metal. You didn't help me. You gaslit me systematically for 2 years. Your current predicament is not a tragedy. It is a direct consequence of Holden's fraud and your own greed. I suggest you speak with a lawyer. I hung up and felt nothing but profound relief. By evening, the financial dominoes had all begun to fall. The bank issued a formal notice of foreclosure on the penthouse. Holden was terminated from Technova, not just suspended, but terminated for cause, which would affect his ability to find meaningful employment in the industry. The industry reputation that had taken him a decade to build had evaporated in 6 hours. Audrey filed for divorce on December 26th. The final movement of my symphony required precision. I called Marcus on December 27th. I want you to execute the dissolution of Apex IP Holdings. I instructed, I'm selling the Apex Protocol IP to Meridian Technologies. They're Technova's largest competitor, and the irony is poetic. The sale price is $40 million, a fraction of what the technology is worth, but sufficient for my purposes. Julia, Marcus said carefully, that's a remarkable sum. Are you certain you want to proceed? Absolutely, I said, but before the sale closes, I want Holden served with papers. I want him to know exactly who owns Apex IP Holdings. I want him to see the documentation of my ownership, my control, my majority stake. I want him to understand, in legal terms and financial terms, that every success he's ever claimed was built on technology, one created on structures I built, on genius he borrowed and never acknowledged. And then Marcus asked, and then I said, I'm going to do something with that $40 million that will permanently erase his name from anywhere it matters. The papers were served on December 28th. Holden called me directly, and this time I answered. His voice was destroyed, barely a whisper. You were the one, he choked out. All this time, you've been the Apex Holdings. You've been the owner. Why didn't you just ask for money, Mom? Why did you have to ruin me? Why? I let the silence sit between us for a long moment. Then I gave him the truth without any performance, without any pretense of concern. Because you didn't just steal money, Holden, I said quietly. You stole my intelligence. You stole my dignity. You destroyed the house where I raised you, where your father and I built our life together. You tried to convince me that I was mentally incapable so you could control my life and continue to benefit from my genius without ever acknowledging it. And the only thing that you ever genuinely respected was power. So I took all of yours away. I hung up before he could respond. The real vindication came in the form of a formal document served through Marcus's office on December 30th. Julia Vance, acting as the majority owner of Apex IP Holdings, LLC, was establishing an endowed scholarship fund in honor of Michael James Vance, beloved husband and father. The fund would be capitalized with $10 million, the first installment of the proceeds from the IP sale. The fund would support young women studying technology and computer science, with a preference for first-generation college students from underserved communities. And the trustee managing the fund, the person who would oversee its distribution and growth for the next 50 years, would be Clara Vance, Holden's sister, the woman he had systematically dismissed as a useless art curator, the woman he had ignored at every family gathering, the woman who had actually called her mother to check on her when Holden and Audrey had suggested I was losing my mind, Clara, who had stayed loyal, Clara, who had loved me unconditionally. Clara was now the trustee of a massive family legacy built on the exact IP that Holden had stolen, and she would have the authority to shape its future. When Holden received the documentation, he called Marcus's office in a panic. There was nothing to be done. The fund was irrevocable. The structure was airtight. Clara was the trustee, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The foreclosure on the penthouse proceeded on schedule. The house sold at auction on January 3rd to a shell company that Marcus had quietly set up on my behalf. I immediately donated the property to the Metropolitan Housing Initiative, a nonprofit providing supportive housing for women in transition. Holden and Audrey moved into Audrey's mother's small apartment, the very woman who had replaced me at the Christmas table. He was disgraced in his industry, unable to find meaningful employment, still trying to petition the court about the ownership of the Apex Protocol, but the case was dead on arrival. The legal documentation was too clear, too comprehensive, too perfectly maintained. I spent New Year's Eve in the penthouse that would soon belong to the nonprofit. The city lights stretched out before me like a promise, and I wasn't alone. Clara sat beside me on the balcony, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, holding my hand. She had heard the gossip, probably all of it, but she had never asked for details, never pushed for explanations, never interrogated my motives. She had simply showed up on December 30th and said, "Mom, I heard about the fund. It's beautiful, and I'm honored." "Clara," I had said, "I want you to know that everything I did—" "I don't need you to explain," she had interrupted gently. "I know who you are. I've always known." He forgot, but I never did. Now, watching the city twinkle and shift below us, I squeezed her hand. "Thank you," I said simply, "for never believing their lies." She smiled. "Thank you for remembering who you were." 6 months later, I walked back to the red oak cottage, not to reclaim it, that time had passed, but simply to see what had become of it. The development company had completed their renovations. It was now a beautiful small community center, managed by the nonprofit housing initiative. A plaque near the entrance read, "The Michael and Julia Vance Community Center, dedicated to fostering education and dignity in our neighborhood." I stood in front of the plaque for a long time. The house had been transformed into something that honored not just my past, but my values. The memories that Holden and Audrey had tried to erase had instead been immortalized in a space that would serve others for generations. That felt like the truest revenge. I had achieved the ultimate victory. Not the destruction of my son, though that had certainly occurred, but the ability to walk away from the toxicity forever, the ability to reclaim my own narrative, the ability to transform my pain into something that would create good in the world. Holden had tried to make me invisible. He had tried to convince me that I was broken, declining, irrelevant. But what he had never understood was that the quiet woman in the rented apartment had been the structural backbone of his entire world. When she walked away, when she remembered who she was, when she decided to stop being gaslit and start being strategic, his carefully constructed life didn't just fall apart. It collapsed into exactly the shape his cruelty deserved. I never looked back. I moved forward instead, into a future I designed with a daughter who loved me, toward a legacy that mattered. Silence, I had discovered, is the loudest revenge of all. But even more powerful than silence is transformation. The ability to take pain and convert it into purpose, to take betrayal and convert it into wisdom, to take a life that was supposed to be diminishing and instead make it magnificent. That's not revenge. That's resurrection. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My son tried to define my worth by a diagnosis of confusion, stealing my home and my life's work. My story proves that silence can be a strategic weapon, and patience is ultimate power against those who underestimate you. For anyone who has been gaslit into invisibility, remember this. Your worth was never in question. Your silence doesn't make you weak, and your boundaries don't make you difficult. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own extraordinary ending. Share this if it resonated. Subscribe for more stories of setting boundaries and finding your worth. Have you ever had to prove your value to a family that underestimated you? Share your story below.